It's time. Hi, and welcome to European Liberal Forum and Forus webinar on AI in the EU. Hard to say, but still it's going to focus trustworthiness following the European Commission high-level expert groups focus on trustworthy AI. My name is Stefan Larsson. I'm an associate professor in technology and social change at Lund University, but also at the think tank Forus. I'll be the moderator today. So first, let me welcome the keynote speaker, which is Fredrik Heintz. You are a computer scientist and associate professor at Linköping University and also part-time at Lund University. And most importantly, perhaps today, is you're a member of the high-level expert group on AI. Hi, Fredrik. Before I hear you, and before we allow, now you can say hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Now you can hear me.
Yeah, thanks. Good. But before you hold your keynote, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have two invited guests, of which one is Anna Maria Ducek-Segersten. Hello, Lund University. Senior lecturer in European Studies, particularly relevant here. And then Enes Zaza in Czech Republic, who is also performing the national analysis within this project. This is a project that is the host for this webinar. And Enes is going to do the national analysis of the Czech Republic. I'm going to get back to you in a bit. And before I hand over to Fredrik, I'd like to say that in the commentary of the stream on YouTube, you can post questions. There's a possibility to do that, and we'll pick up some of them later at the second half of this webinar when we discuss and when we reflect about AI in the EU from a trustworthiness perspective. Now, Fredrik, please present to us and share your screen.
Thank you very much. So I would like to thank you very much for the invitation and have this opportunity to talk about trustworthy AI in Europe. And I think this is actually very interesting because there is a lot of discussion around the world about AI and the impact of AI on society. And of course, everyone is talking about what are they doing in China, what are they doing in the US. And it seems to be the kind of, or many people have the opinion that Europe is, lagging behind or not as participatory as many of these. And actually, I think it's very interesting because Europe has said that, yes, we want AI. AI is very important, but we don't want any AI. We want our AI to be human-centered, which means that AI should not be a goal in itself, but rather a means to improve the situation for us as individuals, as citizens, as consumers, and so on and so forth. And we want the AI to be trustworthy. And what I'm going to talk about today is the work that we've been doing in this high-level expert group on trustworthy AI, and a little bit about the research challenges connected to that, because I'm also a researcher. But to start, I will put this a little bit in perspective. So if we take AI in Europe, we actually come from a very strong AI research track record. So Europe has been very much on the front lines of developing AI since its inception. And actually, if we look at the number of publications in AI, Europe is still publishing more than the US and China. However, the challenge is, of course, that our change rate is lower. So that even though we have a pretty good situation at the moment, we are not growing as fast as we should. The second aspect is skills. And of course, Europe, like everywhere else, has a short supply of talent and skills in the area. So in some sense, this is not different from the rest of the world. The strong point from a European perspective here is that Europe is a netto exporter of talent. So actually our universities and so on are actually very good and produce a lot of competent people in the area. but many of them choose to move outside of Europe afterwards. The third item is when it comes to industry and the kind of application of AI. And here we can see that there is actually a relatively low digitalization of European industry and therefore relatively low uptake of AI. And this is something that the Commission has pointed out and that they are now focusing very much on. And likewise, that the European investment in AI is relatively low, both when it comes to research and when it comes to private investment. And actually, there's data from different reports being made, where it shows that actually the biggest difference is not in the public funding, but in the private funding, where North America and Asia has a significantly higher private investment in AI. And this is mainly due to a relatively small number of very large companies investing heavily in the area. So this is an area where Europe needs to pick up speed. So actually the Commission started to say, I think it was a year ago, that they are working towards having a yearly investment of 20 billion euros in AI. From the Commission side, they said that we would probably invest about 3 billion euros a year, which means that we need to meet this with at least 6 times as much from private investment and from member state investments. So of course, this will be a major challenge moving forward. And when it comes to the low investment in Europe, I actually like to use this picture, or maybe not a low investment, but a low industrialization of AI. And it's because AI in itself is a technology which requires a lot of things around it. So if you're going to do large-scale AI today, you need large-scale data centers that are able to collect, manage, and process large volumes of data. And actually, when it comes to the kind of core AI and machine learning know-how, we are pretty good, but we don't have we have fewer companies with the big, large data centers and the competence and experience of running them. So I think there we have part of the reason why the pickup speed is lower in Europe. So the European AI strategy is that, as was announced, I think 2 years ago, is that they will work towards 3 different areas: boost technological and industrial capacity and AI uptake, prepare for socioeconomic changes, and to ensure appropriate ethical and legal framework. And especially for this 3rd pillar, they established this high-level expert group on AI, which was selected from, so basically everyone could apply to be a member of this. I think they got more than 500 applications. And from these, they selected 52 members. And we began our work in June 2018. And we got the task of doing 2 things. We were supposed to write ethical guidelines for Trustworthy AI, and we were supposed to develop a investment and policy recommendations for the Commission, which we did a year later. So in this ethical guidelines, we defined Trustworthy AI as requiring these 3 things. First of all, it has to abide with the laws and regulations that are applicable. And actually, this can be challenging in some cases. And secondly, it has to satisfy a number of ethical principles. So we define 4 ethical principles. And thirdly, which I think is actually quite interesting and quite different from many of the other similar frameworks, and that is that good intentions is not enough. You also have to have a safe and robust implementation. So you really have to build a solid system that can deal with these things in a good way. And I think that's really interesting. The second thing which sets these guidelines apart from many others is that we didn't satisfy ourselves with only working on this principle level, which in some sense is relatively simple to come up with a number of high-level principles. But we took 2 more steps. First step was to go from the principles into a number of requirements. So what are the things that you need to actually achieve? And as yet another step, we also start to develop what we call an assessment list, which provides questions for self-assessment. So basically a company or organization that are interested in determining, do we satisfy these requirements, they can start to go through this assessment list and guide them in order to determine how well they satisfy the requirements. So I think that's very nice. So now after that kind of general introduction, I want to mention a few things. So first of all is the definition of AI. And I think this is actually a very challenging area because since AI is such a broad concept, there are many different views on what AI is. And the kind of the definition I usually use is from John McCarthy, who was one of the founders of the area. He basically said that artificial intelligence is the science and engineering of making intelligent machines, especially intelligent computer programs. The challenge with this definition is that there is no commonly agreed upon definition of what intelligence is. So an alternative definition, which is more closer to the one used by the European Commission, is that it says that artificial intelligence refers to systems that display intelligent behavior by analyzing their environment and taking actions with some degree of autonomy to achieve specific goals, which is a good description of how these systems work, which means that these systems work by collecting information and then by analyzing this information, trying to figure out what do I need to do in order to reach these goals that I have been given from the outside, which means that it's us humans who define what the purpose of these systems are, and then the system itself try to achieve these goals that we give it with some degree of autonomy. And the lowest form of autonomy could be some form of just making recommendations to humans, and all the way up to actually acting on its own. A third definition, which is from the Association for Advancement of AI, AAAI, they define it as the scientific understanding of the mechanisms underlying thought and intelligent behavior and their embodiment in machines. So actually, this is a broader definition that's both focusing on the actual systems displaying intelligent behavior to actually also study internally how these processes work. So the point here is that I actually think this defining what AI is in a narrow sense is actually quite hard. And personally, I'm not even sure it makes sense to do it too narrowly. Yes. Another interesting question, and also this is part of why we need this discussion at all, and is the question of why is AI different? So what makes it different from a normal computer program? In some sense, the first two aspects here, scale and speed, of course, applies to basically every computer program. And it's that the scale that these work at is much greater. So, for example, if you automate some functionality, previously you might have had, say, 10 people performing this, but now instead you will have a single program that tries to do this, which means that if there is something wrong, previously maybe one of these people would have done it differently. So you would have gotten slightly different behavior from the different people, but now you get the same behavior from the same system at large scale. The second is speed. Things go much faster. I mean, we're talking millisecond or sub-millisecond decisions, which introduces challenges when it comes to, for example, monitoring. And then we have some aspects of the way more that these systems are built, which means that usually they're built in order to optimize some particular property or some particular measurement, which means that they're very much single-minded and optimization-based. If you manage to get these optimization criteria well, then you will have a very good system. But if you miss some important maybe other criteria, then you might get a system that ignores certain things that actually were important. And this is called the value alignment problem. So how do we make sure that the values and the purpose of these systems are aligned with what we want them to do? And here I think an interesting analogy is this what actually no, the ghost in the bottle, or spirit in the bottle, or whatever you call it in English, where you have this magic ghost appearing from a bottle, and then you get three wishes. And usually the third wish is always to go back to the way it was before, because it's so hard to wish for what you, to make the correct wishes. And maybe the first story of this is King Midas, which wished that everything turned into gold, which was very nice until he wanted to eat, and then his food turned into gold. So this just shows how hard it is to make proper wishes. And then there's some interesting aspects. In a sense, these systems cannot break any rules. They will follow the rules no matter what, which means that in human situations, we usually have always the opportunity to break the rules. And in many situations, we break the rules because it actually improves the situations. You could take a common example from like driving. There might be this solid line which you're not allowed to cross. But if there is a child jumping out in the street, of course you will break the rule and drive over this solid line. But if you program a computer never to break any rules, it will not be allowed to do that. So then it might actually increase the risks of getting into an accident by not breaking the rules. And then we have some interesting aspects when it comes to needs and consequences, and that these systems, they don't need anything. You cannot punish a computer. You could turn it off, and then, if you want to, and then a month later or 2 years later, whatever, you can turn it on, and it can basically continue where it was, where it left off. And actually, this has larger implications than we might think, because if you look at safety, or take the example of an airplane, why do you trust that the pilot will land the plane safely? Well, because you assume that the pilot will also want to survive. So since the pilot also wants to survive, you believe that he or she will do whatever they can to land the plane safely. But if you now replace the pilot with the computer, how can you make sure, or how can you trust or expect the computer to actually want to survive? There is no real need for the computer to survive. And actually, I think this is actually a quite interesting question. So there are no consequences for these computer systems based on their decisions. So I think these are some aspects that makes AI different. So what are then the ethical principles that we put up? So we defined 4 principles. So the first one is respect for human autonomy. And so what we want is that the AI systems should not replace people, but rather they should augment, complement, and empower people to do things. And here we have some interesting cases. For example, when it comes to nudging, you might have an app on your phone which tries to get you to eat healthier or to exercise more. But in some sense, what this app is doing is trying to override your, will of not doing these things to get you to do things that you otherwise wouldn't have done because it's good for you. So it's trying to nudge you in a positive direction. But what if this was done by, say, a government, that they want, it's good for you to be healthy, it's good for you to not smoke, it's good for you to exercise regularly, so we should have this kind of nudging on a large scale. Is that okay to override human autonomy? According to this principle, we would say probably not. The second principle is prevention of harm, which is pretty straightforward in the sense that we want safe and secure systems, and that you should protect the physical and mental integrity of people, which means that you have to make sure that there are no negative consequences. And actually, this is quite challenging when it comes to looking at groups, for example. How do you make sure that maybe only part of society get significantly improvements, while other parts of society get worse conditions due to this? And then the third principle is fairness, where we want equal and just distribution of benefits and costs, which again, it's easy to say, but it's actually very hard to define what fairness is, because there are so many different ways of defining fairness. So how do we do this so that we can share the benefits, but also split the cost equal or in a fair way? The fourth principle is about explicability. So this is the principle which is all about transparency, openness, explanations, and so on. So basically, how can we understand what these systems are doing and why? And again, it's one of these things that are easy to say, but it's actually quite hard to define. What is an explanation? I honestly haven't seen an explanation of what an explanation is. And my personal view there is that I mean, explanations are more situation dependent. So whether it's a good or bad explanation depends on what you want to do, whether it allows you to do so. So these are at least the four principles. And then when it comes to requirements, they're actually quite similar. So I will not go through them in detail, but basically breaking these down a little bit into 7 requirements: human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity, non-discrimination, fairness, and societal environmental well-being. So this is actually looking at the broader societal context, and then accountability. And finally, when we have this assessment list, is that we actually try to formulate questions that allows a company or organization to understand how to operationalize these requirements. The challenge is that we actually came up with a very long list. So in the original list, it had 131 questions. So during the fall, after we published it, we've had a pilot study with a number of organizations where they actually tried to use this assessment list and came back with very detailed feedback, which we are now processing. So we are now in the process of improving these assessments and coming up with an updated assessment list that we expect to be delivered in June this year. So this were the kind of introduction to these guidelines. So I wanted to just give a few examples. Why are these important and why are they hard? So this is an example that I often use, and this is KG, 19 years after he lost against Google DeepMind's AlphaGo. And what's interesting is not that he lost, but what's interesting is to view the human expert commentators commentating these games. Because there were several times during the games where the human experts basically said, haha, the computer made a mistake. A human would never play like that. And then, of course, the computer won anyway. But what's interesting here is that we judge what the computer was doing based on our experience. So how do you judge whether a computer is doing a good or a bad thing when we more compare with our experience rather than compare it to whether it was actually a good or a bad move? Because obviously it was a good move because the computer won. But at the same time, it was hard for us to understand and understand why it made this move. And I think that's a very interesting aspect. Another challenge is, of course, bias. There's a lot of discussion about bias, both when it comes to, so in some sense, I think the easy bias is that when the data that you have do not represent reality. So basically, it's been this example, for example, of face recognition system, which worked very well on white males, but did not work as well on colored women. And in a sense, it turned out that they hadn't collected enough information, hadn't trained the system well enough on a diverse set of people. But in some sense, that's relatively easy to fix by collecting more data and improving the training of these systems. What's more challenging is when you collect data about the real world, but the real world is not as like you want it. For example, there is a lot of discrimination in the real world, and there is, for example, salary discrimination based on gender. So if you were to define a system that looked at salary statistics, probably it will replicate the bias that exists in the world. And how do you then deal with that? Then you actually have to make a normative statement and say that we don't want the world as it is, we want to make it different. But then you cannot collect data from the world, but you have to create the data somehow. And then someone has to create this data, and someone has to take the responsibility for that data. And I think that's a quite challenging question, which I think is very interesting. And of course, we have this question of that machine learning is still very brittle in the sense that small changes can get large changes in the output. And how do we deal with this robustness issue? And we also see that these systems might be right, but for the wrong reason. So there's been a number of studies looking at what do these systems really do, and actually it turns out it seems like they're using relatively simple heuristics that work well in those cases where they're tested, but if you test it in a larger context, they do not work as well. So this is a challenge. And I've already mentioned this, that what is fairness? And I mean, it's really hard to define what fairness is. Is it equality or is it equity? Should we share it equally or should we have equal outcome? For example, just as one example. All of these questions need to be figured out before you can actually operationalize them in a computer system. And then we have this notion of explainability. And there is this question of, we have these systems today that seem to work pretty well, but we don't understand what they make those decisions based on. And actually, and then there are other types of methods which are more easy to understand, but are not as accurate. So the question is there a trade-off between accuracy and explainability? Can you get both, or do you have to choose? And if you have to choose, what do you prefer? Do you prefer a highly accurate system that you don't fully understand? Or do you prefer the lower accuracy system that you understand what it makes the decisions on? And I think this is a very interesting question. And in some sense, I think that the challenge, if you take these deep neural networks as one example, the problem is not that we don't understand it. I mean, in some sense, we perfectly understand how they work in the sense that it's a mathematical function that you compute. The problem is that this mathematical function has millions of variables, and we as humans are terrible at understanding multi-million dimension information. So in some sense, the question is, what can we explain and what can we understand? Are there valuable things that we want the system to do, but in some sense, we don't have the vocabulary to understand what we do then? And I actually think this is also very closely connected to abstraction. How do you abstract from these million of variables, those that really matter from a human perspective? And I think there's a lot of very interesting things related to that. So to summarize some of the research challenges related to these 4 ethical principles, when it comes to respect for human autonomy, we have human AI interaction. How do you design systems so that they can interact with humans in a way that respects the human autonomy? How do you ensure meaningful human control, especially when the systems may make make decisions in a different way than we do, and maybe at a faster scale than we do? And I mean, take this example of, I mean, how do you put yourself above a system which has internalized all the known information that exists? I mean, we as humans cannot read every book that's ever been written, but in a sense, a computer might be able to do that. On what grounds would you say that, no, wait a minute, you are wrong and I am right? I think that's also an interesting question. We have safety questions and value alignment questions, fairness, and then this area of accountability, transparency, and explainability that are all both very interesting, but also very open research problems. So what are then being done? So I mean, in Sweden, we have, for example, the AI Sustainability Center, where both me and Stefan are involved, where we try to help organizations to use AI in a way that's ethical and long-term sustainable. We have the Wallenberg Autonomous Systems and AI Autonomous Systems Software Program, Humanities and Society, WASP-HS, which is funded by a private foundation in Sweden, which has a research program where they study the kind of impact of AI and autonomous systems on different aspects, for example, ethics, economy, law, and so on, where me and Stefan also has a project on trust and consumer trust. what makes a consumer trust a system. So there is some research going on, and very quickly we also have this policy and investment recommendations. So what we did there was that we studied a number of enablers. So what are the things that we need in order to build a positive impact in Europe? So, for example, it is empowering and protecting human society, transforming Europe's private sector, catalyzing Europe's public sector, and ensuring world-class research capabilities. So basically private, public, research, and society at large. And then the recommendations were then around raising funding and investment. We need much more investments in AI. We need to have the appropriate data and computing infrastructure. We need skills and education. And actually, I think we will have there's a radical need to upgrade the educational system in order to deal with all these challenges. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions there that I unfortunately don't have time to go into. And finally, we need to have an appropriate governance of these AI systems, and of course the data that we use and the processes and so on and so forth. So since this is such an important question, the European Commission has issued a white paper on artificial intelligence, which they call a European approach to excellence and trust, that was released in February this year, and where there is currently an open consultation period where people can provide comments and feedback on this white paper. So basically they define an ecosystem of excellence and an ecosystem of trust that they hope, or that their intention is, that this will push Europe to really kind of leverage the opportunities of AI while minimizing the risks. So, and then there is also a bunch of international organizations, for example, CLARE, which is a grassroots organization, basically gathering most or many of the AI research labs around Europe under a common vision of excellence across all of AI for all of Europe, with a human-centered focus. So in this organization, we're really trying to push AI in Europe and make sure that it benefits everyone. And it's very much based on AI researchers. So to conclude, I've been talking about AI as a way of both understanding intelligence and developing systems that exhibit intelligent behavior. And I do believe that AI will affect all aspects of society. And that's why trust is so essential, because it will influence all of us. And if we don't trust these systems, it means that people will start to turn away from them, and it will be much harder to actually get the good use out of this. And in order to be trustworthy, if you follow these ethical guidelines that we have defined, then it should be legal, ethical, and robust. And something that they haven't talked that much about is education. And I think one consequence of this is that we really need to focus much more on education and lifelong learning. And there's also a significant number of research challenges related to these principles and how can we achieve this trustworthy AI. And that in order to study these, we really need interdisciplinary research. This is not a purely technical question, but it's also a social and humanities related question. So we really need people from all kinds of disciplines to work together to try to solve this really important problem, so that we can make sure that we get this trustworthy AI that can benefit everyone in society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fredrik. Thank you very much. I mean, this is there's so many really interesting angles here. I mean, I could talk about transparency for an hour or for all day, but I think we should focus. You mentioned issues around governance and policy in a sense. So that is also the sort of the core for this ongoing forest project, which also Hannes is involved in, which deals with the sort of the relationship between the top level, the EU Commission level, where the expert group is sort of where they are, where you are, and the relationship to national strategies. So how member states behave and act, and what they can do, how should they strategize around these things. So that's sort of relationship is a focus in that project. So I'm going to hand over to Anna-Maria first. Comments or reflections in terms of government policy? Yeah.
There's so many things. And again, thank you, Fredrik, for making AI an understandable subject, even for people who are not into computer science. I think it's a talent that very few possess, but you surely do. So that was really most refreshing to hear you go over this as a non-computer scientist myself. Well, I have a couple of questions just in terms of how the expert group, in a sense, relates or brings their own national experiences, and in which way these ethical guidelines will be complemented by something more concrete that the European Commission would like to see implemented, because guidelines are principles and they can be more or less implemented as they appear to be of a more voluntary basis. However, if the ambitious goals of the Commission are to be becoming a reality, more investment, more education and lifelong learning, and so on, I think there should be some policies. And so the question that I have more at the first is like, in which way, what is the next step between formulating the ethical guidelines and some policy recommendation to the Commission? What is the Commission going to do with your work? What is the Commission going to suggest? And what's the actual plan to unite the 27 member states in their approach towards these concrete objectives? Or is it a lot of leeway that is going to be given to the member states to achieve these goals? How is that relationship between the EU and national states working out? Thank you.
I mean, so first of all, I mean, I'm not the representative of the Commission, so I cannot really speak for them. I can speak from my understanding of how things work. So, I mean, actually, in parallel with our group, which is actually, we're independent from the Commission, but that there is a separate group with the member states that they have been working on their coordinated AI strategy. So, the European Commission came out with this coordinated plan, and then the member states have been asked to come in with their own national AI strategies that should then be coordinated. So I think one next step is that these national AI strategies should be coordinated at the EU level. That's one thing. And then the second thing is exactly this white paper that has been issued. So in some sense, that is a position statement from the Commission that these are the things we want to do. And now we want your feedback on, are these the right things or not? So that is the next step. And I mean, I think it seems to me that they have been very clear that, yes, they want to radically increase the investment. I mean, they've been talking about this 20 billion euros a year, which is quite significant. And secondly, they've also talked about further regulation. And there's also been talk about this, that actually regulation, or in some sense, constraints is a way to drive innovation. And that they have very positive experience of introducing strict environmental regulations earlier when it comes, for example, to cars and so on. And that was driving innovation in Europe. And then when the rest of the world also adopted the same kind of policies, European companies had an advantage. And in my interpretation is that they aim to do something similar here as well.
Well, the white paper is also up for consultation, right? So so anyone can submit commentaries for it for a couple more weeks.
Another month, 14th of June, I believe the deadline is.
Now I want to shift to Anna's. From your view, commentaries or reflections, and we will also speak about Czech Republic if you want to share the status of that strategy.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me. Yes, I'm with the Institute for Politics Society, as you mentioned, the project we're reviewing regarding national strategies for AI. And it's an analysis of the national AI strategy of the Czech Republic as set forth by the EU Commission's approach in terms as highlighted by the ethics guidelines for Trustworthy AI, published by the high-level group, as well as the policy and investment recommendations. I actually have a question for Fredrik. You mentioned how pilots actually take over when they land the plane. but much of the flight, I'd say majority of it, is actually run on autopilot. How would you then define between the principles of transparency, the accountability of whether the pilot is to blame for any mishaps, God forbid, or whether it's a system that's a fault?
So, I mean, I think the important part is that there is a pilot on board. Whether he or she is flying is probably not the important part. As long as we as passengers believe that the pilot is flying, we trust the person to land us safely. And I think, I don't know the regulations in my head, but I do think that the pilot is probably responsible. So even if the computer makes mistakes, I think the pilot is responsible. But what we've actually seen is that there's been accidents when the pilots have misunderstood the consequences, where basically if the pilot had let the plane fly, you might have had a different outcome. Of course, there is the other way around as well, but so I think this interaction is the tricky part. But I think from a legal perspective, it's pretty clear who has the responsibility.
Thanks, Anna Maria. I mean, now
yes, I have some more questions for sure.
Yes,
for sure.
Yes.
It's always like, do I have time to ask all these questions? Because again, going back to this idea of who does what when AI is needed. I think the coronavirus crisis is probably the best opportunity to showcase the merits of AI, because that's what everybody is waiting for. I don't think I've seen more positive coverage of technology and education, and in particular research, including at universities, ever. So I feel like everyone is like supportive of work that we all do here at the university. It feels very good. AI is one of the science branches that has been very much looked up at, saying you guys who do AI can help solve the mystery of the virus and so on. But at the same time, and I'm not talking about in which way AI can actually help us understand the virus mutations, or if any, or whatnot, but I think, in a sense, the bigger discussion, and I'm wondering if this is a discussion that is taking place in higher instances. The coronavirus is about to change, in my opinion, the way we work, the way we move, the way we take decisions, occasionally being so remote, right? So the risks of going into a workplace, into a factory, for example, or even into a hospital, are none for a robot driven by AI, but huge for a human. And this kind of automatization of the labor force, I think it's now becoming more of an acceptable notion, because the coronavirus crisis has highlighted the vulnerability of the human in flesh and bone, so to say. So I'm curious if there's any discussion that connects or uses the coronavirus pandemic as a motor to discuss the implications of this necessary transformation towards the AIification, automatization of the labor force.
Probably. So, I mean, what to kind of answer part of you, I mean, this question of robots and technology has been used in other similar situations where it has been as a dangerous for people. And actually, when I did a lot of work on autonomous systems, we talked about dull, dirty, and dangerous. That you want to kind of support humans to avoid that people don't have to do those things that are either dirty. I mean, it could be nuclear contamination, or dangerous. I mean, it could be flying close to the electric wires, and also these things that are dull, just plain boring. Those are the things we should try to automate. So I think those are still valid, and maybe more valid in these situations. When it comes to the kind of current crisis, I think the major change is that previously things were moving relatively slow. Now it seems like everything got accelerated. So I think that is more the case, that it's accelerated the change that has been going on since before. And when it comes to the role of AI, I think AI will probably play a very important role in the economic recovery. That what I don't think we will see the same companies coming back and the same kind of jobs coming back, but rather we will see this transformation, that there will be new types of jobs, new type of companies, new ways of delivering services. I mean, just take this specific case of supply chains. That, I mean, suddenly you have certain countries that basically close down, and all your supply chains into that or from that country are lost. So now companies will require to have much more flexible supply chains, which also means that there will be more complex supply chains, which will be harder for humans to manage manually. And that if you can then automate part of this process, then you can manage much more complex ecosystems and supply chains. So I think there will be a very important role.
I just want to briefly mention to the audience at the stream, please comment. I mean, please ask. We have only 13 minutes left. And Anas, you had a question. We chatted earlier on relationship to the guidelines and Corona, right?
Yes. Yeah, if I may. Previously, I was wondering the number of applications or contact tracing apps that utilize machine learning or some facets of AI. They do draw a line between ethics of traceability, accountability, as well as privacy in relations to the EU's guidelines of democracy. Whether these can be used to track people in nefarious ways as opposed to being beneficial. Where do we draw the line between safety, being tracked, and COVID and this whole pandemic, and even after pandemic, whether citizens are being tracked, traced, or even monitored?
So I think there are a number of challenges related to this question. The first one is that, I mean, misuse. I mean, assuming that these tracing apps are used for exactly what they're supposed to, and you basically throw away all the data and so on, then maybe it's okay. But it's very easy to say that, oh, now we have all this nice data, let's continue using it. So I think that's one aspect. I mean, how do you limit the usage of this data so that it's only being used in those things we think is acceptable, and we don't use it for those things we don't think is acceptable? I think that's one. The second aspect is over-reliance on the kind of, it gives a false sense of high accuracy. And I think we have a major challenge when it comes to validating the actual quality of these systems. And I think that's maybe even more the case of all these models that flourishes these days. And basically you get a model that gets any result you want. And the question is, how do you validate that your model or tracing app or whatever actually works? And here I think we have some really interesting questions. How do we convince ourselves that these systems work, that they're only being used for the positive things and not used for potential negative usages? And thirdly, that we can actually rely on the results. And I mean, I think it's very open questions. And I think it's actually kind of one of these, what is a science that of this technology, is that the same kind of system can be used for very good purposes and very bad purposes. And in some sense, it's not the application itself, but it's how it's being used and what do you do with the data. And I mean, I think this, say, face recognition is another one of these applications where, I mean, it can be very beneficial. I mean, if you can identify children that has been kidnapped or people that are lost, I mean, that is very good use. But of course, you can also use it to track your political opponents and try to put dirt on them and so on and so forth. And I mean, it's not the facial recognition itself that's causing this, but rather how we decide to use the data.
I think this is kind of parallel to your opening statement about the race. I mean, the metaphor of that we're racing towards a sharp AI or something like that versus a good AI. So the European track or the European path is more this trustworthy. So the value base in conjunction with the methods. I want to shift track a bit because we got a question from our audience on the future of the high-level expert group. And I know you're active right now and preparing calming recommendations. So the question is, Any thoughts on sort of what happens? What is the role for the high-level expert group for the Commission after these two published documents? So basically, what are you doing now, and what are you planning this year, in a sense? Just briefly.
So our mandate ends now. So we had a 2-year mandate. And so actually we have delivered what we're supposed to deliver after only half the mandate period. So therefore we use the second part of the mandate to update these assessment lists. That is what we're working on. And after that, we don't know. I mean, our mandate ends and then the Commission is free to do what they like.
All right, so we'll see then for that part.
See.
Another question that comes up, to bring it back to the national member states, what do you, I mean, this is for the entire panel. What do you think the member states should do then? I mean, the EU Commission has told the member states to at least devise, create AI strategies by mid-2019 was the directive, which not every member state did. Some were early, some were in the mid, and we're still waiting for a few. But and the early ones might be revised also, of course. But what do you suggest the member states do? Should they be influenced by the work of the high-level expert group? How should they relate to the white paper? Anyone?
I can volunteer. Sure. I mean, I think this would have been another question that I would generally be interested to find out more, whether or not there is some degree of consistency across the national member states or not. I was curious about the results of your project, Stefan and Anas, about this, because my feeling my sense is that the deep divide within Europe between the countries that are better off economically and countries that are less developed economically continues to be there, if not accelerated, when AI is brought into the mix. So instead of leapfrogging with the help of AI, my fear is that the divisions between countries from East versus countries from the West, or North versus South, may increase because of the way their resources towards AI, both from the private sector and from the national governments, are unevenly distributed. So how likely is it that a country like, Bulgaria or Romania would have a fast-growing AI sector compared to, let's say, Sweden or Finland, where that is, economically speaking, a different situation? So I think I'm afraid that unless there is some more coordinated action and a more redistributive approach to resources dedicated to AI investment and education, I think these divides in Europe will be perpetuated rather than annulled through the use of technology. So that's basically my immediate thought.
Anna's comment on that specific, or my first question?
Yeah, in terms of funding, I think the European Commission, as well as the expert high-level group, has placed in forms of grants, and which are accessible, I believe, by all member states. So whether they be East, West, there shouldn't be a divide, especially with this technology. It's emerging. It should be available and open access for all member states, as well as the rest of the world, in terms of international cooperations. At the end of the day, we just bring it back to basics. These algorithms are quite complex in nature, but they can deliver in terms of socioeconomic development, in terms of just any economic as well as educational aspects. They're all there. And I think every member state, as well as the rest of the world, has access to these things, as well as as Fredrik can also bring in, the policies that are set forth or the investment recommendations. They're easily accessible to all.
So, I think there is some truth to that in a sense. It's very easy in some sense to transfer these. The kind of technology itself is not heavy in some sense. It only requires computational infrastructure. Of course, that is some investment, but it's relatively modest. You don't need very complicated machines or supply chains or these things. So in that sense, it is very transferable. The question is more education. And if you look at education, the Eastern states have a tradition of very strong science and mathematical education. So, they should be well equipped to, and they do. Czech Republic is a good example of a country that is really pushing AI and have received a large number of ERC grants and other European funding for AI. So I think that's an example of countries doing very well. I do think there is a real danger in different countries adopting very different strategies. And I do think, and actually that's explicitly mentioned in the white paper, that they don't want to see a lot of different national initiatives, but rather they want to focus on the coordinating European initiatives. And here I think there is a challenge, because if you look from a purely national perspective, I mean, if we look, I mean, what do Sweden need? Okay, we need these things. Because I mean, we're a small country, but still we need kind of cover many of these areas. But if you look at Europe as a single entity, we could of course benefit much more from specializations to say that, oh, let's put all the computer vision in Czech Republic and put all the natural language processing in Greece and put all the autonomous driving in Sweden or whatever. I mean, we do this specialization, which makes sense from the kind of European perspective, would not make sense from a national perspective. And here I think there is a tension and a trade-off. How do you make sure that you have both the national perspective and the more European and global perspective? And I mean, if you want to say, I mean, to me, the kind of a very sad part about this Corona crisis is how quickly the international collaboration broke down. And basically every country is scrambling for themselves. And I mean, even the Nordic countries are behaving very differently and closing the borders between the Nordic countries that we haven't had closed for, I don't know, hundreds of years. So, I mean, I think there is some what you say, what you mentioned, Anna Maria, I think is a real danger. And I think the Commission seems to be aware of it.
And this is the problem, like the Commission may be aware of it, but may not have the authority to actually intervene in more forcefully or more concretely, but rather suggest ways, but without being the one driving. I think it's a privilege of the member states in this particular case. So definitely Corona crisis may be the impetus for further cooperation, or maybe exactly as you say, a return to the puzzles of individual nation states, basically trying to manage for themselves. Yeah, it doesn't seem to work very well to look at it.
I think they will realize that it will not work, so that we have to collaborate. I do think, I mean, most people realize that we have to collaborate, and that's the only way we're going to make progress, and probably will be even more important. And I mean, a challenge from a European perspective is that we lack this kind of large internal market. I mean, if you're in China or the US or India, you have a huge internal market. While if you want to reach the European market, you have to navigate many different languages, judicial systems, and so on and so forth. So I really think this single internal market is very important, and that requires collaboration so that we can get companies that can grow and become strong also in Europe. And I think here we also need to think more about the investment and the whole startup ecosystem. And I think there is, I mean, I talk to companies sometimes that say that, I mean, we have a choice. Either we go to a European investor and we get X amount of money. If we then go to a Chinese or American investor, we get 10 times that amount. So the European investors are not willing to put money in risk. We are quite risk averse, which also reduces the kind of innovativeness. And so I think we do have a good ground when it comes to research. And I think the kind of general, welfare systems are relatively well developed in Europe. We would need to be a bit more risk-taking and be better at innovation and really leveraging these technologies, both for public, but also the private sector, or rather way around. I mean, not only for the private sector, but also the public sector. I think we have a lot to gain. But I do think we need to collaborate, and I do think we have a great opportunity to really make progress and to focus on this trustworthy, human-centered AI for the benefit of all.
That would be a perfect final word. Our time is up, and want to thank our panelists, Anna-Maria Ducek-Segestin and Anna Sessa, and I want to thank Fredrik Heintz. And I want to mention to the audience that please follow the project. I mean, we will post this video, we will post it in the commentaries. We had a podcast, me and Fredrik, with our friends in Portugal through the European Liberal Forum. And we will produce a report also within this project, of which also Anna Sessa will be writing a chapter, which I'm looking forward to. So thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of the webinar. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.